As Western governments see coordinated steps to bring Russia to the negotiating table, diplomatic efforts span Washington, Brussels, and beyond. With the Trump-Putin meeting cancelled, a new Russian envoy in place, and Washington's diplomatic outreach to China, the transatlantic landscape is shifting. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss this is Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.
So from your vantage point, how significant are these Western efforts, particularly the U.S. and EU talks on new sanctions against Russia and China? How's that shifting the Kremlin's calculus?
So far, it hasn't shifted their calculus. Putin is still determined to fight this war. He believes that he has the ability and the right to take over Ukraine and re-subjugate it to Russia once again. So that's his calculus and what he's trying to do. But what the West is doing now is very, very important. We have Ukraine and the West aligned as much as that we have ever been. We have economic pressure on Russia, which we are seeking to increase to try to starve Russia of the funds it needs to continue the war. And we are providing military support to Ukraine so it can defend itself against Russia. We ought to be increasing the pressure there too. We ought to be providing more long-range weapons so that Ukraine can hit the weapons that are being fired at it from deep inside Russian territory. So we've made some progress in the last week, increasing the economic pressure. We need to do more.
And speaking of progress, one of your articles you published on August, you actually mentioned how the peace deal is closer, but not yet close. What are the remaining bottlenecks that you think the West must overcome to actually make any sort of critical progress?
Right. So I think we need to recognize that Russia is never actually going to agree a peace agreement with Ukraine. Putin does not believe that Ukraine is a legitimate sovereign country. He believes it should be part of Russia. He does not believe that Zelensky is a legitimate leader. He calls him a Nazi. So he's never going to reach a deal. That means our objective should not be the peace agreement per se. It should be a ceasefire, getting enough pressure on Russia that he feels compelled to stop attacking. If we can get Russia to the point of a ceasefire, then we need to accelerate our efforts to integrate Ukraine into transatlantic institutions, EU and NATO, as quickly as possible so that we can solidify that tenuous peace.
We're looking at how the United States and Washington is coordinating their sanctions efforts. And of course, China is going to be on the crosshairs as well. How do you think this is going to change the transatlantic relationship going forward with all these different dynamics going on with the Chinese support of Russia and the EU, US aligning to sanction them as well?
Yeah, it is very interesting, as you say, that the dynamics here are complex, sometimes moving in opposite directions. On the one hand, I would argue that we are very closely aligned and coordinating with our European allies in ways that we haven't for a long time. And yet we are also involved in trade disputes with our European allies, which is pulling in the opposite direction and makes many Europeans very concerned about the United States. Likewise, we are putting a lot of pressure on China over trade and the economy. And yet we also want to do a trade deal with China. And then ultimately, a great request from President Trump would be for President Xi of China to tell Vladimir Putin it's time to end the war. I think China would benefit from ending the war. The US would. If we put secondary sanctions on China as well as India, because of their support for Russia in this war, that makes the prospects of getting a trade deal more difficult. But nonetheless, I think it is something that we are likely to do. And in the meantime, China, of course, is pursuing its own interests independent of Russia. Its Belt and Road Initiative, its investments in Europe, its tech dominance. And so this is something that we need to push back on as well, still while trying to get a deal with China and also get China to help end this war.
You brought up a U.S.-EU trade dispute, which is kind of rough there. And in the meantime, China has also been trying to actively court European leader among this friction between the United States and the European Union. How do you assess Beijing's role in Ukraine's war diplomacy and its impact on Western alliances? Do you think these economic factors will be kind of a speed bump when it comes to effectively sanctioning Russia or the secondary sanctions on China?
Yeah. So China has been looking out for Chinese interests. I wouldn't say that they are aligned with Russian interests. To the extent that they both agree they'd like to weaken a global liberal order that is run mostly by the West, okay, they agree on that. But China is not actively supporting Russia militarily. And when I say they're pursuing their own interests, it means if Russia wants to buy components from China, they'll sell them. Ukraine as well. Ukraine is buying components from China. If Russia wants to sell cheap energy to China, China needs energy, so it'll buy it. China will buy energy from Iran as well, and also from elsewhere if they can. And in terms of the sanctions, China does not want to be subject to Western sanctions over its engagement with Russia. So if we push for secondary sanctions to go after refineries, to go after banks, to go after ports, the shadow fleet of vessels, these would actually have an impact on China and could cause China to back away a bit from some of its willingness to engage with Russia economically. As far as the post-war environment is concerned, we will eventually be in a post-war environment. China wants to maintain ongoing, deep economic ties to the US and Europe. So it's going to be very careful not to burn those ties right now during the course of the war.
Right, we're looking at also U.S. President Donald Trump going to be meeting his counterpart Xi Jinping very soon. And of course, there's a lot of speculation on what they will be talking about. And most of us, this part of the world, is looking at whether or not there will be any new developments when it comes to Ukraine. However, some people are less optimistic about this meeting, saying that this is probably farther down the priority list. Realistically, where do you think Ukraine will lie when it comes to their conversation?
Yeah, I think it will come up, but as you say, it's not going to be the number one issue. The number one issue is going to be trade and seeing whether we can get a stable economic trading relationship between the U.S. and China that both countries feel is fair enough. The U.S. thus far has not felt that it is fair, so we're going to want to rebalance that. Then rare earth minerals. China has suspended exports of rare earth minerals. These are things that are vital for certain technological goods. I think that is a bargaining chip that China has put on the table. Hopefully that gets resolved as well. I think regarding Taiwan, an agreement to disagree, but no military action anytime soon. I think that would be a possible and desirable outcome. Some mutual concern over North Korea. North Korea has been firing missiles. They continue to develop their nuclear program. China wants to keep this in check, independent North Korea, keep the Korean Peninsula divided, and yet at the same time prevent North Korea from too much adventurism. And that would be a mutual area of agreement with President Trump. And then finally, if we do have some alignment on these issues between the U.S. and China, there could be a mutual interest as well in seeing the war ended, Russia's war in Ukraine. The U.S. has done a lot to put pressure on Ukraine and to convince Ukraine to accept a ceasefire in place wherever the lines are today. China could help put a little pressure on Russia to just accept a ceasefire. I don't know that they will do that, but it should be a topic of conversation.
All right. Now, I'm also curious with this whole week of diplomatic back and forth, there's a lot of development going on. And at the end of the week, if you were to tally the points a little bit, would you say that after this week of development, things have turned a little bit more in Ukraine's favor or against?
Well, definitely more in Ukraine's favor, no question. The sanctions regime against Russian oil, that is very important, and that will make a difference, and that is very much in Ukraine's favor. The use of some long-range weapons, such as the Storm Shadows, have been very effective in going after some of the facilities in Russia that are farther into Russian territory but are being used to attack Ukraine. So they've made some progress there. And then recently on the front line, Ukraine has been able to take back some territory that Russia had previously conquered. The Russian forces are really in a very weak position on the front line, not having enough fuel, not having enough ammunition, having very poor leadership and very poorly trained troops. Their method is to simply try to advance through infantry, probing attacks, and they are losing so many people that it is degrading the quality of the Russian forces.
And circling back to your closer but not yet close statement, I'm also curious, in your opinion, what is left for the United States as well as Europe to do in order to force Russia onto this negotiating table?
Well, I think two things that are immediate. One of them is put in place not only the sanctions on Russian oil, but also secondary sanctions on any businesses involved in trade with Russia in oil and gas. So this would be India, it would be China, it would be others, and it would touch banks, it would touch vessels, ports, refineries, insurance companies, whoever is enabling that business deal with Russia in oil and gas. That's number one. The second thing I would do is provide the longest range weapons to Ukraine right now. In the case of the U.S., this is going to be the Tomahawk missiles. I would then tell the Ukrainians, don't use them if Russia agrees to a ceasefire, but put them in Ukraine now and let the Russians know that they will be used if Russia keeps this war going.
Thank you so much for your input and insight. I really appreciate it, sir. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
My pleasure.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World News Tonight. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.